The first thing I noticed about Jarvis' house was that it did not want to be found. No sign hung from the iron gate. No number marked the stone pillars that rose out of the fog like the ribs of something buried and dug back up. I had circled the block twice before I understood that the absence of an address was itself an address, a message meant for people like me. Turn around, this is not a place for you. I did not turn around. I had spent 11 months building the lie that would get me through that gate, and I was not going to let a little fog take it from me. My name is William Dyer, and on the morning I walked up that gravel drive with a suitcase in one hand and a false biography folded into my chest pocket like a second heartbeat, I believed I understood exactly what I was doing. I believed I was the hunter. I did not yet understand that the house and the man who ruled it had already opened the door for me long before I ever knocked. I straightened my collar at the base of the steps. My reflection in the brass door plate looked steadier than I felt. Dark hair combed into some approximation of professionalism, eyes that I hoped read as tired from travel rather than tired from lying. I had rehearsed my name and my false credentials in the mirror of a gas station bathroom 3 towns back. William Dyer, archivist, formerly of the Ashcombe Historical Society, here to catalog the Jarvis family's private collection for a modest, respectable fee. It was not true. Ashcombe did not know my name. The only thing true in my entire introduction was the name itself, and even that felt like a kind of theft, saying it out loud in a place that had no business hearing it yet. The door opened before I raised my hand to the knocker. He was taller than the photographs. That was the first unfair thing about Gregory Jarvis, that even the most flattering image of him, the ones I had spent weeks studying in old society pages and blurry telephoto shots pulled from 3 different investigators who had tried and failed to get inside this house before me. None of them prepared me for the way he filled a doorway. Dark hair, always a little too long at the collar as if he did not have patience for barbers, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, and eyes the color of a storm that has decided, mid-afternoon, not to break after all. Gray, restless, and entirely too aware. He looked at me the way a man looks at a puzzle he has already solved and is simply curious to watch you attempt. "Mr. Dyer," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like something borrowed, like he already knew it did not belong to whatever story I was about to tell him. "You're earlier than I expected." "I hate to keep people waiting," I said, and offered my hand. His grip was warm and sure, and it lasted a half-second too long, long enough that I felt the pulse of my own nerves answer back through my palm. I told myself it was only nerves. I told myself a great many things over the following weeks that turned out to be lies I had built for my own comfort, brick by brick, right alongside the ones I had built for him. "Come in then," Gregory said, stepping back to let me pass, "before the fog decides you belong to it instead of me." I did not know, stepping over that threshold, that I already did. A woman met us in the entry hall, small and silver-haired, with the brisk, assessing look of someone who had run this household longer than she cared to admit. Gregory introduced her as Mrs. Abington, the housekeeper, and she took my measure in a single glance, the way I imagine a seasoned soldier sizes up a new recruit, not unkindly, but without illusion. "Another archivist," she said, in the tone of a woman who had seen archivists come and go through this house before, none of them staying long enough to matter. "Well, we'll see how long this one lasts." Mrs. Dies. "Abington has buried 3 of my father's assistants and 2 of my own," Gregory said, with a dryness that startled a laugh out of me before I could stop it. "Metaphorically, I should clarify, before you decide to flee back down the drive. One of them was very nearly literal, Mrs. Sarrow," Abington said darkly, and swept off toward the kitchens before I could ask what on earth she meant by that. "She exaggerates," Gregory said, though something in the set of his jaw suggested she did not. "Not entirely, and I filed that away too." One more small stone added to the growing weight of things I did not yet understand about this house. That first night I lay awake long past the hour I should have slept, listening to the house settle around me. old wood contracting in the cold wind, finding every gap in the window frames and somewhere far off, so faint I could have imagined it. The low murmur of a voice that did not belong to any of the staff I had met so far. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a great many things that first night, most of which turned out, in time, to be only half true. The house swallowed sound the way old houses do, the way grief does. My footsteps on the marble in the entry hall seemed to vanish before they reached the ceiling, and I found myself lowering my voice without meaning to, as though Jarvis House were a library or a church. Or a mouth that had learned to keep its own secrets by keeping everyone else's quiet too. Gregory led me through a corridor lined with portraits, men and women with his same storm-colored eyes, staring down from gilt frames as if they were still deciding whether to let me stay. "Your family," I said, because it seemed the sort of thing an archivist would say, and also because I was hungry to know. "My inheritance," he said, with a dryness that made me look at him twice. "Which is not always the same thing as family, Mr. Dyer, whatever the resemblance might suggest." I filed that away. I filed everything away in those first days. Every clipped sentence, every door he did not open, every servant who dropped their eyes when his name was spoken in a certain tone. I had come to catalog his house. What I was actually cataloging, from the very first hour, was him. He showed me to the east wing, a long room with tall windows and shelves that climbed to a ceiling painted with a faded mural of hounds running through a black forest. Ledgers and boxes of correspondence sat stacked with a carelessness that told me no one had truly looked at this collection in years, though someone, clearly, had been paying to keep it dusted. "You'll have 6 weeks, Gregory said, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, watching me take in the room the way a man watches weather roll toward his land, uncertain if it will bring rain or ruin. After that, I'm afraid the Historical Society will simply have to be patient a while longer." 6 weeks is generous, I said. "Is it?" His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "We'll see if you still think so." Pliggle. He left me there with the dust and the ghosts of his ancestors, watching from the walls, and I stood very still in the middle of that room for a long moment, listening to my own heartbeat, trying to remember why I had come. I had come because of my brother. Peter Dyer had worked in this house 18 months before I arrived, hired as a private secretary to help manage the Jarvis family's correspondence, or so the letter he sent me had said, cheerful and full of plans. The kind of letter a younger brother sends when he thinks his life is finally turning towards something good. 3 months after that letter, Peter was dead. The official report called it an accident on the cliff road, half a mile from the estate gate, his car found empty at the bottom of the ravine. His body never fully accounted for in a way that let me bury him properly. Let me stop imagining some nights that he was still down there in the dark waiting for someone to come looking. No one from Jarvis House had come to his funeral. No one had sent flowers, or a letter, or so much as a single word of condolence. Though I later learned, through channels that cost me more money and more of my own dignity than I like to admit, that Peter had been let go from his position 2 weeks before he died. Let go for reasons no one would put in writing. I did not know, when I invented William Dyer the archivist, that I was walking into the house where my own name might already mean something to the man who ruled it. I did not know that Gregory Jarvis had read every one of my brother's letters after his death, searching for an answer he never found. And that when a man named William Dyer had written to request access to the family archive, Gregory had recognized the surname within the first sentence and had said yes anyway. The days took on a shape I had not expected. I woke early, before the house stirred, and worked through the ledgers with the particular hunger of a man pretending to catalog history while actually hunting for a name. I found nothing of Peter's in the first week. No trace, no correspondence, as though someone had gone through this archive before me and lifted every thread that led to my brother out of the record entirely. That should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, it made me angrier, and anger, I have found, is a poor substitute for caution. Gregory joined me most afternoons, ostensibly to answer questions about the family history, though I began to suspect, somewhere in the second week, that he came because he wanted to watch me work. He had a way of leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, saying nothing for long stretches, only observing. As though I were a fire he had lit and was curious to see how long it would burn before it either warmed the room or consumed it. "You catalog like a man looking for something specific," he said one evening, when the light through the tall windows had gone the color of a bruise healing. My hands stilled over a ledger of household accounts from decades before I was born. "I catalog like a man who is thorough," I said. "There's a difference, is there?" He came further into the room, close enough that I could smell rain on his coat, though it had not rained that day. "Thoroughness doesn't usually come with that particular tension in a man's jaw, Mr. Dyer. That's the look of someone chasing a ghost." I forced my hands to stay steady on the page. "Everyone who works in a house full of dead ancestors is chasing a ghost, Mr. Jarvis. That's rather the nature of the job." Something flickered behind his eyes, amusement or warning, I could not tell which, and I was beginning to realize that with Gregory Jarvis the two often wore the same face. "Call me Gregory," he said, instead of answering. "If you're going to lie to me in my own house, William, you might as well do it on a first-name basis." My pulse jumped so hard I was certain he could see it in my throat. "I'm not lying to you." "No," he agreed, far too easily, far too gently, and the gentleness frightened me more than any accusation could have. "Not yet, but you will, before this is over. I'd simply like it on the record that I knew, and I let you anyway." He left before I could ask him what he meant. I sat alone in that long room with the hounds running silently across the ceiling above me and did not open another ledger for the rest of the night. I only sat there, my heart going too fast, trying to understand a man who spoke in riddles that felt less like games and more like mercy. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with zero ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. There was an evening not long after the cellar, when Gregory found me in the garden instead of the archive, sitting on the cold stone steps with my coat pulled tight against a wind that smelled of the sea somewhere beyond the estate walls. He did not ask why I had left my work. He simply sat down beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and for a long while neither of us spoke. "You're thinking of him," Gregory said eventually, not a question. "Every day I'm in this house I think of him," I admitted. "I keep waiting for it to feel like less of a wound and more of a scar. It hasn't happened yet. It took me 3 years to stop waking each morning expecting to find some new evidence that would undo everything I believed about my own family," Gregory said quietly. "I don't think grief moves on anyone's schedule but its own, William. I think all we can do is choose not to carry it alone." I looked over at him then, at the careful, unguarded honesty in his face, lit gold by the last of the evening sun, and felt something in my chest tighten that had nothing to do with grief at all. "Why does it feel," I asked, before I could stop myself, "like you understand exactly what I'm carrying, when a month ago you were nothing more to me than a name I intended to ruin?" "Perhaps," Gregory said, his voice low, "because I have spent a great deal of that month watching you, and finding that the things I learn about you only make me want to know more, not less. I did not expect that when you first walked up my drive. I confess it has rather thoroughly undone my plans to keep a professional distance." My heart was beating too fast for the stillness of the evening. What plans were those? The ones where I remained a courteous host, and you remained a temporary archivist, and neither of us allowed the matter to become anything more complicated than that, he said, and the corner of his mouth curved. Rueful and warm at once. "I'm afraid you ruined them rather early on, William, somewhere around the second week." When I caught myself looking forward to our afternoons in that dusty room, a great deal more than a man in my position has any business doing, I did not trust myself to answer with words. Instead, I let my hand find his on the cold stone between us, and felt his fingers curl around mine, warm and certain, and we sat like that until the last light went out of the sky and Mrs. the Body. Abington came to fetch us both in for dinner, muttering something about catching our deaths that neither of us paid the slightest attention to. It was not a declaration. It was smaller than that, and larger too. The quiet, growing certainty that whatever I had come to that house believing I no longer wanted to leave it, the same man who arrived. And some part of me had already begun to hope that Gregory did not want me to either. I should tell you, if I am being honest, and I am trying, now, finally, to be honest, even if I was not then, that I felt the pull toward him from almost the first week. It arrived the way weather arrives, not asked for and not entirely unwelcome, a low-pressure system settling over every room he walked into. It was not only his face, though his face alone would have been enough to undo a lesser man's concentration. It was the way he moved through his own house, like something contained, like a large animal that has learned, through great and costly effort, to walk quietly among breakable things. It was the way the staff went still and attentive whenever he entered a room, not from fear exactly, but from a kind of magnetism I did not have a name for yet. It was the way he looked at me, really looked, as if my face were a document he intended to read all the way to the last page, however long that took. I told myself it was strategy. Get close to the alpha of the house. That was the word the older servants used for him, half in jest and half not. Alpha, as though this were an old estate that still ran on older rules than the ones written in law books. Get close to him, learn his secrets, find out what happened to Peter. I told myself every night, lying in the small guest room at the end of the east corridor, that whatever I felt watching him cross a garden in the last light of evening was simply the discomfort of proximity to a man I meant to destroy. But lies, even the ones we tell ourselves in the dark, have a way of thinning with use until you can see straight through them to the thing you have been trying not to look at. The thing I was trying not to look at was this. I wanted him. Not only his secrets. Him. The low rasp of his voice when the house had gone quiet for the night. The particular way his mouth moved when he was choosing his words with care. The warmth that came off him like a hearth, even from 3 feet away. I wanted him with a hunger that had nothing to do with my brother and everything to do with the terrifying, inconvenient fact that I had never in my life felt so entirely seen by another person. Even while I was lying to him about almost everything, there was a man named Aldous Wren who visited the house twice in my second week, and both times the atmosphere shifted the moment his car appeared at the top of the drive, servants moving a little faster. Doors closing a little more firmly, Gregory's whole bearing changing into something colder and more careful than I had yet seen from him. My late uncle's solicitor, Gregory said the first time, when I asked, his voice carefully flat. He handles certain of the estate's older affairs. Pay him no attention. I paid him a great deal of attention. Wren was a narrow, watchful man with pale eyes and a habit of appearing in corridors as though he had been standing there for some time before you noticed him. He found me in the archive room during his second visit, running a finger along the spines of the ledgers I had not yet catalogued, and I did not like the way his mouth curved when he saw how far I had gotten. "You're thorough," he said, in a voice like paper tearing slowly. "Your predecessor was thorough too." He found a great many things he shouldn't have. My whole body went still. "I don't believe I caught your meaning, Mr. Wren." "No," he agreed. "I don't imagine you did. Not yet." He replaced the ledger he had been holding with exaggerated care, as though it were something fragile or something dangerous, and left without another word, his footsteps fading into that particular silence the house seemed to specialize in. I did not sleep well that night. I went over his words again and again, turning them like a stone in my palm, trying to decide whether they were a threat or only the strange manner of a strange man who had spent too many years in the company of secrets. I did not yet know that Wren had been one of the men named in Peter's journal, one of the architects of the very cruelty Gregory had spent years trying to unravel, and that his warning to me had been, in its own twisted way, entirely sincere. 3 days later I found the cellar archive locked for the first time since my arrival. A heavy iron key required where before there had only been a simple latch. When I asked Mrs. Abington about it, she pressed her lips into a thin line and told me, in a voice that did not invite further questions, that Mr. Stair, Jarvis had ordered it locked for the archivist's own safety, and that I would do well not to go looking for a key. I went looking anyway. It is, I think, the central flaw of my character that I have never once in my life left a locked door alone when I believed something important lay behind it. I found the key 3 nights later in a drawer in the estate office that I had no true business searching, and I let myself into the cellar archive alone past midnight, with only a small lamp for company and my heart going far too fast in my chest. The room was colder than the rest of the house and smelled of old paper and older rot. Boxes lined the walls unlabeled, and it took me the better part of an hour to find the one that mattered. A plain wooden crate shoved behind a stack of empty picture frames containing a slim, leather-bound ledger far newer than anything else in the room. I had only just opened it, only just begun to make out names I recognized from the society pages, names of men still very much alive and still very much respected in this county, arranged beside numbers and dates and the kind of coded language that takes on a horrible clarity once you understand what it is hiding. When I heard the cellar door open above me, I closed the ledger and doused my lamp so fast I burned my thumb on the hot glass and stood pressed against the cold stone wall in the dark, my pulse a drum in my own ears, absolutely certain I was about to be caught doing the one thing that would end my entire mission before it had properly begun. But the footsteps that came down the narrow stairs were unhurried, and when a second lamp flared to life at the bottom of them, it was Gregory's face. It illuminated not Wren's, not some nameless guard sent to silence a curious archivist in the dark. "I thought I might find you here," he said quietly, and there was no anger in his voice, only a tiredness that went bone deep. "Mrs. Abington told me you've been asking after a locked door. I should have known that would only make you more determined to open it." "I found a ledger," I said, my voice unsteady, the stolen crate still open at my feet. "Names, dates. I don't yet understand what it means, but I think—" "I know what it means," Gregory said, and crossed the cellar to crouch beside the crate, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "I have known for 3 years. William and I have been trying very slowly and very carefully to build a case strong enough to burn every man in that ledger to the ground, without also burning down everyone innocent who depends on this house for their living. Wren is one of them. I would ask you not to go looking for him again, for your own safety, until I've finished what I started." I looked up at him, at the exhaustion carved into his face, and felt the last of my anger toward him crack and shift into something far more complicated. "You could have told me this from the beginning," I said, "instead of letting me stumble around in locked cellars at midnight like a fool." "I could have," he agreed. "I did not, because I did not yet know if I could trust you with a secret that has already cost one man his life. I am telling you now because I am beginning to believe I was wrong to wait this long." He held out his hand to help me up from where I had crouched beside the crate, and I took it, and neither of us let go again for a long moment, standing there in the cold dark among the buried evidence of 3 generations of cruelty, the first true understanding passing silently between us that we were, whether either of us had intended it or not, no longer strangers playing separate games in the same house. The turn came on a night in the 4th week, during a storm that shook the tall windows of the east wing hard enough that I set down my pen and simply listened to it. Glad of an excuse to stop pretending I was working, Gregory found me there, as he often did, though this time he did not lean in the doorway. He came and sat across from me at the long table, an unopened bottle of something amber between us, and for a long while neither of us spoke. "You had a brother," he said finally, and the words landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I did not ask how he knew. I had spent 4 weeks assuming, hoping, that my lie was airtight, and in that single sentence I understood it had never once fooled him. "Peter," I said, because there was no longer any reason to pretend otherwise, and because saying his name out loud in this house felt like finally setting down something I had been carrying too long. "He worked here 18 months ago." "I know." Gregory's jaw tightened, the first genuine crack I had seen in his composure since I arrived. "I know because I hired him, and I know because I have not been able to forgive myself for what happened to him since the night he died." The room seemed to tilt. "You knew who I was," I said, "from the beginning. The letter, the archive request, you knew my name. The moment I read it." He poured 2 glasses without asking if I wanted one, and pushed one across the table toward me, his hand steady even as his voice was not. "I could have turned you away at the gate, William. I could have told you the archive was already spoken for, sent you back to whatever city you came from before you ever set foot on my land. I did not." "Why?" My voice came out rougher than I meant it to. "Because I owed your brother a debt I could never repay him directly," Gregory said. "And when his name walked back through my door wearing your face, I thought, perhaps this is the only chance I will get to make it right." I sat with that for a long moment, my glass untouched, my hands not quite steady on the table's edge. What happened to him? The report said an accident. I never believed it. "You were right not to." Something moved behind his gray eyes, old grief wearing the shape of a much younger man. "Peter found something in this house he was never meant to find. A ledger hidden in the cellar archive detailing an arrangement my late uncle had made. A network of men who preyed on vulnerable Omegas under this family's protection, using the Jarvis name and the Jarvis money to keep it quiet for 3 generations. Your brother found the proof. He came to me with it, frightened and furious, asking how I could have let it continue. My throat had gone tight. And I told him the truth, that I had suspected for years and had spent that entire time trying to gather enough evidence to end it without destroying every innocent person whose livelihood depended on this estate. I told him to give me time. He did not trust me to keep my word. He was going to take what he'd found to the press himself, expose all of it, mine and my uncle's and everyone else's sins together in one great fire that would have burned the innocent along with the guilty. Gregory's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles paled. 2 nights later, he was dead. I have never believed it was an accident. I believe the men in that ledger learned what he intended to do and silenced him before he could." The room had gone very cold, or perhaps that was only me. "You let him go," I said. "The employment records. He was dismissed 2 weeks before he died." "I dismissed him to protect him," Gregory said, and for the first time since I had met him, his voice cracked open entirely, raw and unguarded. "I thought if I severed his connection to this house publicly, whoever was watching would believe he no longer had access to anything dangerous and would leave him alone. I was wrong. I have spent every day since believing his death sits on my hands, William, because in trying to save him, I made him a target with nothing left to protect him." I do not know how long we sat there, the storm working itself out against the windows, both of us undone in our separate ways by the same 18-month-old grief. I only know that at some point I realized I was crying quietly and without much dignity, and that Gregory had reached across the table and taken my hand in both of his, not to comfort me exactly, but simply to have somewhere to put his own unbearable guilt. "I came here to destroy you," I said finally, my voice thick. "I built an entire false life to walk through your door and find the proof that you had killed him, or ordered it, or covered it up. I hated you before I ever met you." "I know," Gregory said. "I have known since the day you arrived, and I let you stay anyway because some part of me hoped that if you looked hard enough you would find the truth instead of the story you came here believing, and perhaps you would forgive me for the both of us. I would like to tell you that everything became simple after that night, that grief shared is grief halved, and the 2 of us walked forward from that storm as easy allies, already halfway to something more. It was not that simple. Trust, once broken by circumstance and false names, does not rebuild itself in a single confession, however honest. For several days after that night, I avoided him taking my meals in the East Wing rather than the dining hall, telling myself I needed time to grieve the version of this story I had believed for 18 months before I could face the version that was actually true. Gregory did not push. He left small kindnesses instead. A fire already lit in the archive room before I arrived each morning. A note tucked into an old ledger pointing me toward a locked cabinet of correspondence he thought might finally give me the closure the false version of my mission never could have delivered. In those days of distance, I found myself watching the house differently than I had before. I noticed things I had been too focused on my own mission to see clearly. The way the younger staff spoke of Gregory with a loyalty that could not be bought, only earned. The way he had quietly paid for a groundskeeper's daughter to finish her schooling after her father's accident, never mentioning it himself, so that I only learned of it through an offhand remark from Mrs. There. Abington, the way, even in his grief over Peter, he had never once allowed the household to suffer for his own private guilt. It became harder, in those days, to hold on to the version of him I had built in my mind over a year of hatred. That version had been simple, a villain with a single face, easy to aim a year of fury at. The real man was a great deal more complicated, and a great deal harder to keep at arm's length, however much my grief wanted a simple enemy to blame. It was in that cabinet that I found Peter's own hand at last, a journal hidden behind a false panel filled with his careful handwriting, his fear and his fury, and near the final entries, his growing trust in the man who employed him. Gregory is not what the rumors say, Peter had written. Only a week before he died, he is trying to fix what his family broke, even if it costs him everything. I only wish I had trusted him sooner. I think, if things were different, if I were not so afraid all the time, I could have loved a man like him. I sat with that journal open on my lap for a long time, weeping in a way I had not allowed myself since the funeral. Grieving not only my brother, but the version of Gregory Jarvis. I had spent a year hating on the strength of a lie. I told myself to survive the not knowing. When I finally went looking for him that evening, I found him in the garden standing alone beneath a sky finally clear of storm, his shoulders set with the particular tension of a man bracing for a blow he believes he deserves. I read his journal, I said. Gregory did not turn. I thought you might, eventually. I left the cabinet unlocked for a reason. He trusted you, I said, near the end. He wrote that he thought, if things were different, he could have loved you. Something in Gregory's shoulders broke, just slightly, like a held breath finally let go. I loved him as a man loves someone he is trying to protect and fails, he said quietly. Not the way Peter meant it, and not the way I think you are asking me. But I have carried his death like a debt for 18 months. William and I did not expect his brother to walk through my gate and make me feel for the first time since he died that perhaps I am allowed to be forgiven. I crossed the wet grass to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him even in the cold evening air. I don't know how to forgive you, I admitted. I don't know if that's mine to give or if it was ever yours to ask for. But I know I don't hate you anymore, and I don't know what to do with a heart that spent a year building a weapon out of hatred, only to arrive here and find there's nothing left to aim it at. Gregory turned to face me then, his storm-gray eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. Then perhaps, he said, low and careful, as though the words themselves were fragile, you might consider aiming it somewhere else entirely. Where? I asked, though some part of me already knew, already felt the answer rising in my chest like heat. Here, he said, and touched 2 fingers, gentle as a question, to the center of my chest, directly over my heart. If you'll have it. I have wanted to say that since the first afternoon you sat in my archive room looking for a ghost you never should have had to chase alone. I will not pretend that first kiss solved 18 months of grief, or that it erased a year of lies I had told to get inside his house. Grief does not work that way, and neither does trust. But I will tell you that when Gregory Jarvis finally closed the distance between us in that dark garden, his mouth finding mine with a gentleness that undid me far more thoroughly than any confrontation could have, I felt something in my chest that had been clenched tight since the day I buried my brother, finally begin carefully to unclench. He kissed like a man who had spent a very long time not letting himself want anything and had decided, in that moment, to stop denying it. His hand came up to cradle my jaw, thumb brushing along my cheekbone as though he were memorizing the shape of me, and when we finally broke apart, both of us breathing unevenly in the cold air, he rested his forehead against mine and simply held still, as if afraid that any sudden movement might make the whole moment disappear. "I have wanted this longer than I should admit," he murmured, "since before I understood what your name meant. There was something about the way you walked up that drive, chin up, refusing to be frightened of a house that frightens most men, that I could not stop thinking about. I nearly turned around twice before I reached your gate," I confessed, and felt him laugh softly against my mouth. A real laugh, unguarded, the first I had heard from him since I arrived. "I'm glad you didn't," he said, "though I understand now why you hesitated. I imagine hunting a man you believe to be your brother's murderer is rather more daunting than the average archive request." "You have no idea," I said, and this time I was the one who laughed, startled by how easily it came, how much lighter I felt with the truth finally sitting between us instead of buried beneath it. The weeks that followed unspooled slower than the ones before them, gentler, as though the house itself had exhaled once its two great secrets, Peter's death and my false name, had finally been spoken aloud within its walls. I stayed past my 6 weeks. Gregory did not have to ask twice. We spent our mornings in the archive together now, no longer as investigator and suspect, but as two men slowly finishing the work Peter had started, building ledger by ledger, correspondence by correspondence, an airtight case against the men who had used the Jarvis name to shield their cruelty for 3 generations. Gregory had been gathering evidence in secret for years, cautious and methodical, terrified of moving too fast and losing the chance to catch every guilty party at once. With my brother's journal as the final piece, we finally had enough. Wren came back once more before the case was finished. Uninvited this time, his car arriving unannounced at the top of the drive on a gray afternoon while Gregory was away in the city meeting with the magistrate. "Mrs. Dace." Abington tried to turn him away at the door, and I heard the argument from the archive room, her voice rising in a way I had not heard from her before, sharp with something that sounded almost like fear. I went out to the entry hall before I had fully decided to, and found Wren standing just inside the door despite Mrs. Abington's protests, his pale eyes finding mine with an unpleasant kind of satisfaction. "Mr. Dyer," he said, or should I say, Mr. Dyer, brother of the late Peter Dyer. I confess it took me longer than it should have to place the resemblance. The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. I had not told him. I had told almost no one in that house the truth of my name, and hearing it said aloud in that thin, papery voice felt like a blade pressed flat against my throat. "I don't know what you mean," I said, though we both knew the denial was worthless. "I think you know precisely what I mean," Wren said, stepping closer, and Mrs. Asteray. Abington moved as if to block him, though he was easily twice her size. "Your brother made the mistake of believing he could bring men like myself to account. I would hate to see his brother make the same mistake and meet the same unfortunate end on the same stretch of cliff road." My hands had curled into fists at my sides before I fully registered the fear beneath the anger. "Is that a threat, Mr. Wren?" "It's a kindness," he said, from a man who has seen how these things tend to end for the curious. He looked past me, toward the archive room, toward the ledgers he must have known I had already found. "Gregory is playing a longer game than you understand, Mr. Dyer. I would advise you not to mistake his patience for weakness, and not to mistake your own boldness for safety." He left before I could answer, his car disappearing back down the drive the way it had come, and I stood in the entry hall shaking with an anger that had nowhere yet to go. Mrs. Darrow, Abington's hand gripping my arm as though to hold me upright. "You should tell Mr. Pride." "Jarvis the moment he returns," she said, her earlier briskness entirely gone, replaced by something that looked, in that unguarded moment, very much like worry for me specifically, not only for the house. "That man has never once come here without leaving something broken behind him." I told Gregory that same evening, the moment his car crested the drive, before he had even removed his coat. And I watched something in his face go very still and very dangerous in a way I had not yet seen, a controlled fury that spoke to exactly how much restraint he had been exercising until that point. He threatened you, Gregory said, not a question. He mentioned the cliff road, I said, and watched Gregory's jaw tighten until a muscle jumped there. I don't think it was subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Gregory crossed the entry hall and took my face gently between both hands, searching my expression with an intensity that made my breath catch even through the fear still sitting cold in my chest. William, I need you to hear me clearly. Whatever it costs, I will not let what happened to your brother happen to you. I should have moved faster. I have been too careful, too slow, trying to build a perfect case instead of simply ending this before it could threaten anyone else I care for. You care for me? I said quietly, not quite a question either. I have cared for you since before either of us admitted it to the other, he said. And I am done pretending otherwise, especially now that a man like Ren has decided to remind me exactly what is at stake if I continue to move carefully instead of quickly. That night we worked past dawn, the two of us alone in the archive room with every ledger and every letter spread across the long table, no longer building a case slowly and cautiously, but racing to finish it, driven now by a fear neither of us named aloud, but both of us felt in every hurried page we turned. We'll need to be careful, Gregory said one evening, spreading the last of the documents across the long table where I had first begun cataloging his family's lies. Some of these men still have friends in positions to make our lives difficult, if not dangerous. I've been careful for a year, I said, reaching across the table to take his hand, no longer needing to hide the gesture, no longer needing to pretend it meant less than it did. I think I can manage a little longer, as long as I'm not doing it alone this time. He looked at me then, with an expression I had not yet seen on his face. Something unguarded and almost disbelieving, as though he had not quite let himself believe until that exact moment that he was allowed to have this, allowed to have someone standing beside him instead of watching him from a careful, grieving distance. You're not alone, he said, his thumb tracing slow circles over my knuckles. You haven't been since the day you walked through my door, whatever either of us believed about the other back then. Aldous Wren was arrested on a wet Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after his visit to the entry hall, taken from his own townhouse in view of neighbors who would talk about it for months afterward. Gregory told me the news himself, finding me in the archive room where I had taken to working even in the quiet hours when there was little left to catalog. Simply because the room had come to feel like the place where the truth of us had first begun to surface. It's done, he said. And I heard beneath the careful control of his voice something close to disbelief, as though he had spent so many years bracing for this fight that he did not entirely know how to stand once it was over. Ren and 2 others named in your brother's journal. The magistrate has enough now to see all 3 of them answer for it. I crossed the room and put my arms around him before he could say anything else, feeling him exhale slowly against my shoulder, a long breath let out after what must have been years of holding it. Peter would be glad, I said quietly, that it was you who finished what he started. I only finished it because you walked through my door and refused to let either of us keep pretending, Gregory murmured into my hair. I want you to know that, William. Whatever comes next, I want you to know I could not have done this without you. The evening we finally handed the completed case to a magistrate Gregory trusted absolutely. An old family friend with no stake in the Jarvis name's protection and every reason to see justice done. I stood beside him on the steps of the courthouse and felt, for the first time since Peter's funeral, something like peace settle into my chest instead of grief. It would take months for the full reckoning to unfold. Men who had hidden behind the Jarvis name for decades would finally answer, in public and under oath, for what they had built on the backs of people too frightened or too powerless to stop them. Gregory's own family history would be dragged into daylight, every ugly corner of it, and he would bear that exposure with a steadiness I found myself falling further into day by day. The way you fall into a warm room after too long in the cold. That night back at the house, the storm long past, and the sky over the estate, clear and full of stars, neither of us had bothered to name. Gregory pulled me into the quiet of his own bedroom for the first time, and there was no more pretending left between us. No false archivist, no secret ledger of grief, Only the two of us finally. Entirely honest with each other. "I owe you an apology," he murmured against my hair, much later, when the house had gone still around us and the only sound left was the low, steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear. "For letting you carry that lie alone for so long, when I could have told you the truth the very first day." "You were protecting the both of us," I said. "You didn't know yet if you could trust me. I don't think I even trusted myself." "No," he admitted, his hand moving slowly along my spine, an absent, tender gesture that felt like a promise all on its own. "But I knew, almost from that very first afternoon, that I did not want you to leave when your 6 weeks were finished. I told myself it was only curiosity. It was not only curiosity, William. I think some part of me recognized you before I ever had proof of who you were." I lifted my head to look at him, at the storm-gray eyes that had unsettled me from the moment he opened that heavy front door, and felt something settle deep and certain in my chest. "I came here to expose your secret," I said softly. "I never once considered that you would already know mine, and choose to keep it safe anyway." "I think," Gregory said, brushing a slow, careful kiss against my temple, "that is rather the nature of secrets kept by people who are already, quietly, falling for each other. We protect the things we cannot yet name." Half a year later, the trials had concluded, the guilty men sentenced, the Jarvis name slowly, carefully rebuilt into something Gregory could finally look at without flinching. My brother's grave, which I had visited only twice in the entire year before I came to that house, I now visited every month, and each time I went I brought Gregory with me, and each time he stood quietly at my side and told Peter in a low voice, meant only for the wind and the stone, that he was sorry and that he was trying every day to be the kind of man Peter had believed he could become. Mrs. Abington, for her part, declared herself entirely unsurprised by the two of us, informing anyone in the house who would listen that she had known from my very first week that the new archivist would either be dismissed within a fortnight or would never leave at all, and that she had, if anyone cared to ask, placed a small private wager on the latter within days of my arrival. Gregory paid the wager himself, with great ceremony, over breakfast one morning in early spring, to the enormous amusement of the rest of the staff and the mock outrage of Mrs. Abington herself, who accepted her winnings with the satisfied air of a woman who had never once doubted her own judgment. The archive room changed, too, in that year. What had once been a room of dust and buried lies slowly became something else entirely. A study where Gregory and I spent quiet evenings together long after the last ledger had been cataloged and the last secret finally dragged into daylight, he with his correspondence, and I eventually with a manuscript of my own, an honest account of everything that had happened in that house, written not to expose anyone any longer, but simply because I had come to believe that some stories deserve to be told truthfully once the danger of the truth has finally passed. I asked him once on a warm evening with the windows thrown open to a garden finally free of the fog that had greeted me on my first day, whether he ever resented me for the lie I had built to get through his gate. "No," Gregory said without hesitation, drawing me back against his chest where we sat together on the wide stone steps overlooking the grounds. "I have thought about it a great deal, William, and I have come to believe that the lie was never really about deceiving me. It was about surviving long enough to find the truth. I understand that kind of survival rather better than most people would guess." "And the man I lied to," I asked, "the one who opened the door for a stranger wearing a stolen name? Do you ever wonder who he might have been if I'd arrived honestly instead?" "I think," Gregory said, pressing a slow kiss to my temple, "that he would have opened the door for you regardless, William. I think some part of me had been waiting for you a very long time before you ever knew to come looking, and I do not much care what name you were wearing when you finally arrived. I only care that you stayed." The Jarvis name, when the last of the trials concluded and the last of the old ledgers were finally sealed away for good, no longer carried the weight of 3 generations' worth of silence. It carried, instead, the quieter, steadier weight of 2 men who had found each other inside a house built on secrets and had chosen, at great cost and greater relief, to build something honest out of the wreckage instead. I never did finish cataloging that archive properly. Some ledgers, I think, were never meant to be filed away and forgotten. They were meant to be carried, the way Gregory carried his family's failures, the way I carried my brother's memory, until carrying them together became lighter than carrying them alone ever could have been. I came to Jarvis House as a stranger wearing a stolen name, determined to burn down the life of a man I had never met. I stayed because that man had already seen straight through my disguise on the very first afternoon and had opened his door to me anyway. Not because he did not know what I intended, but because some quiet, hopeful part of him believed that if he simply let me in, let me search, let me grieve, the truth we both needed would find its way to the surface on its own. He was right, it did. And on the far side of all that grief and all those secrets, we found each other waiting, entirely undisguised, entirely known. I had come to expose the Alpha's secret. He had known mine from the very beginning and loved me anyway, long before either of us had the courage to say so out loud. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon, link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.